When I was growing up, I loved to study history. It's kind of an obsession in my family. Both parents were history majors. My brother was a history major. And I changed things up a little by adding religion into the mix to be a history and religion double major. We are all a family of history buffs. When I was 8, my dad would read me goodnight biographies. Eleanor Roosevelt, Amelia Earhart, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and Ella Fitzgerald. Those were the 5 on rotation. And for fun, as a family, we'd watch the Ken Burns Civil War series. We did regular things for fun, too, like sports and theater, but we really did enjoy studying history. To this day, 90% of my dad's reading is history books. And going into history in college, you get a sense that if you can only study history, understand historical context of some of the most egregious evils, then we can be prepared for the world that we live in. We can stop history from repeating itself. Because history is factual, concrete. History is our window into both the past and the future. But my perspective changed when I was 21. I went to see the movie Munich with my family. It follows the true story of a terrorist attack on the Israeli delegation at the Olympics and the retaliation that followed. When we came out of the movie theater, my brother said, "Wow, painful, but it really showed just how justified they were. They did the right thing." And I was shocked and said, "No, the whole point was that violence begets violence, and strength lies in not retaliating." My mom chimes in saying, "No, the whole point was to show the fatalism of it all. There's nothing we can do about hate." And my dad says, "What? No, the whole point was to resist hate and find forgiveness. It was a hopeful story." And I wondered, how could the 4 of us see the exact same story and differ so much in how we experienced it? It led me to realize that history isn't as simple or clear as we'd like it to be. And it's not quite a window so much as a prism. Because at the end of the day, history is stories, dependent on where we shine the light. Stories that only a select few have written and only a select few get to interpret. At the end of the day, history is written not only by winners, but by the profoundly literate winners. I think that's why Reverend Dyer's poem feels like such a painful reminder. I can't feel his pain because I have no real sense of that history. I've read Frederick Douglass's work, but Douglass was hardly typical. And when you think about who his audience was, he must have been cautious and intentional about which stories he told. And I can't help but wonder, is there a whole universe of Frederick Douglass that we might be missing because some things were simply too high risk to share? These are the things that make history more complicated than we can ever really understand. Because we only have so much access to the inner workings of people who lived hundreds of years ago. And Douglass was famous, an extraordinary writer, so we kept records of his writings. What we're really missing, as Reverend Dyer pointed out, are the everyday stories throughout history. And so often what makes up for our lack of the everyday is our personal stories. I connect on a deep level with trying immigration stories today because my family had one. But our country is more interested in my stories. And it tends to take issue with centering the stories that don't place us on a pedestal. This is why Black History Month is such a vital practice. Because it's the one time of year that we actively celebrate and consciously try not to ignore stories from those who are Black. After I saw the movie Hidden Figures a couple of years ago, which centers Katherine Johnson, a Black mathematician who did extraordinary work for NASA, I became really curious about other Black scientists that we might not know. And the story that called to me the most was the story of Alice Ball. Born in 1892, Alice received her master's in chemistry in 1915. Since her work was considered so impressive, she was immediately hired as a professor and researcher at the University of Hawaii. She was the first African American to attend the university, let alone become a professor. She was also the first woman to attend the university and become a professor. Within Alice's first year as a professor, she discovered the treatment and ultimately the cure for leprosy. Sadly, she never got to see the full fruits of her labors, as she died from an accident in the lab in 1916 at only 24. She knew initial treatments were successful, but not that she had actually discovered the cure. And when the president of the college, Arthur Dean, continued her research using all of her methodology, he titled the cure the Dean method, giving her no credit. In 1922, one of Alice's colleagues published a paper crediting her. And the university finally gave her credit in 2000. Part of what makes Alice's story so tragic is the erasure of her accomplishments. It's also endemic of how we as a society treat Black history and, frankly, the present too. Vanessa Nakate knows this all too well. She is one of a handful of extraordinary young climate activists whose work was so well regarded that they were invited to the World Economic Conference in Davos, along with much more well-known activist Greta Thunberg. 5 young women, all climate activists from different countries, gathered for a photo of the historic moment of them together. But when the news coverage showed the young women, they had cropped Vanessa out of the picture, leaving the remaining 4 white women. Her words to the Associated Press were powerful. "You didn't just erase a photo," she said. "You erased a continent." And we see this all the time today. The erasure of Black history leads to the erasure of the Black experience in the public eye. And this is why we must remember that history is not a concrete, factual retelling. It's written by fallible people. This is why we must listen to the stories that aren't ours. Sit down with the gut-wrenching pain, the joy, and the nuances, because we can lift up stories that our society wants us to keep hidden. In fact, it's our moral obligation to do so. One of the most powerful examples of this has been the interruption of the narrative around Christopher Columbus. Every October, we talk about how and whether we should be observing a day off, whether to call it Columbus Day or Indigenous Peoples Day. But this wasn't a conversation that began in earnest until people with power in South Dakota officially changed the name of the holiday as part of a reconciliation process with local tribes. We still erase Indigenous history, just like we erase Black history. But we have made headway because the powerful were willing to yield a story they found comforting to the wisdom of the less powerful. And we are called to do the same with Black history. We will never know what it's like to be in someone else's body, to carry their history, their burdens, their passion. But we must never stop trying. History is a current that takes stories with it. And the healing that we can do is to grasp the stories that are trying to be swept away and shine a light on them. So join me in seeking stories, both past and present, of Black history and experience. Because we can only know the vast diversity that we hold dear as Unitarian Universalists by seeking a multitude of stories we've never heard before. And when we truly honor all the stories, then we will be ready for whatever comes next. Because we're not looking at a selective past or a wishful thinking future. We're looking at our actual past and rising to meet the actual future. I have faith that curiosity can overcome pride. That we will seek out the stories that are all around us. Because when we do, history's river will be healing. And we will all be stronger for it. May it be so. Amen.